Hello everyone, I'm John Sierra, and I am a Tolkien scholar, and I'm here to answer your questions about Tolkien's works, The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, any of his other novels in the Legendarium, or even the man himself. And it was a tough thing whittling down all the fantastic questions I got this past week. I was trying to get it down to 15 questions. That's what we did last week, and I thought 15 is a really good number, right? But I couldn't get it down to 15, so we actually have 17 questions to look at today. So let's jump right in here. Okay, so starting off here, I have a question here. This was submitted anonymously. It's about the elves. Did Galadriel and Elrond help in the Battle of Helm's Deep? No. There was actually only one elf present at the Battle of Helm's Deep, and that was Legolas. He was the only one that was there. Now, in the movie, they kind of did this thing where elves showed up. Haldir was there with a host of elves. Haldir died. Most of the elves seemed to die. Seemed to be a few that got out of Helm's Deep alive. And it was kind of weird because Haldir mentioned something to Aragorn in the film about being sent by Elrond. And I think this is because they were sort of replacing the Dunedain that showed up after Helm's Deep and Return of the King. But it's weird because they're not from Imladris or Rivendell. They're from Lothlorien, and they were even wearing the banners and the clothing of Lothlorien, so that would be Galadriel. So I see how you would ask, did Elrond help? Did Galadriel help? No, they didn't contribute anything to the Battle of Helm's Deep. It's unlikely that they knew that there was going to be a battle at Helm's Deep, because that was happening very quickly. Legolas was the only help there. Now, help did come, but it was Treebeard, Gandalf, and Erkenbrand. Oh, and by the way, just to mention something, Haldir doesn't even die at all in The Lord of the Rings. It's only in the movie where, I guess they felt that they could off him because he's not a super important character, but he's not. He's alive. He must have sailed west or something. So anyway, Gandalf and Erkenbrand arrived when things were going very badly for the heroes of Rohan and sort of flanked the goblins, and then they were driven into a forest that was there, that wasn't there a few moments ago, but it is there now, that's the Huorns, which are sort of like the trees that have become Entish. And keep in mind that trees can move around in Tolkien's world. Whenever they talk about trees moving, they're not necessarily talking about the Ents, which look like trees and can walk, because the Ents are not walking trees. They are the shepherds of the trees. So they are capable of moving trees around, getting them to move, and the goblins were all, basically herded into this forest. They got stuck there. They were all killed, and the Huorns not only killed the goblins, but also consumed their dead, which I have to say is pretty metal of Tolkien to include in that. An eerie mist surrounded them and consumed them and swept up all the dead, and then the trees vanished. So yeah, the book was way cooler. The movie was great. It was cool to see Gandalf show up with Éomer. Éomer was actually already there in the book. I guess they were, replacing Erkenbrand with Éomer in that sense. And Erkenbrand is the king of the Westfold. That's what was mentioned in the book, the Westfold burned. It turned out Erkenbrand was alive. There were men of the Westfold, and that's who Gandalf was bringing with him. Okay, next question, also submitted anonymously, and this is an interesting one. Why does Gandalf heal Theoden of his despair, but not Denethor? So I think this is another one that has a lot to do with the films, the Peter Jackson movies. So I'm going to answer for the films. I'm going to explain how it happened, in the book as well. But Gandalf did not exactly heal Theoden of his despair. What he was doing in the movie was ridding him of sort of possession. He seemed to be not only influenced by Saruman, but it seemed that Saruman was actually possessing Theoden. And, when he said, Gandalf the Grey, you have no authority here, that was not the king speaking. That was Saruman speaking through the king, who was his puppet at that time. And then, you know, you get that great moment where Gandalf casts off his cloak, reveals that he is the White Wizard, and he knocks Theoden, well, he knocks Saruman out of Theoden, I should say, with such force that miles away in Isengard, in the Tower of Orthanc, we see Saruman reel backwards and fall to the ground. Great scene. Now, in the book it was a bit different. Theoden wasn't possessed, but he was influenced by Grima, who was under instructions from Saruman. And I would say, I think the understanding, I don't know if Tolkien would use this word exactly, because I don't know if it was a word that he would have been familiar with, but I would say that Theoden was depressed in the book. That he was getting older, that he was in the twilight years, he was not as mighty as he once was, he was an old, bent man, and he wasn't as an effective ruler as he was before. There was a line in the movie, and it is also in the book, your hands might remember their strength once more if they grasped your sword. Gandalf did say that in the book. And the strength did come back to Theoden, but it came back slowly over time, and we got to see this mighty king ride out once again, and everybody was very happy that the king, you know, especially Eowyn, who was also, I think, depressed. And more on that later, because I got a great question about Eowyn coming up. But anyway, that's how it happened in the book. The movie, it was less subtle. It was more that Theoden was being possessed by Saruman. With Denethor, that's not the case. Denethor is grieving. He's lost his favorite son. He loved Boromir. And I have this theory where Boromir sort of reminds him of his wife. It's not really a canon thing. It's just sort of like... And I'm going to talk about this in another question I believe that I have lined up. But I believe that that's the reason that he seems to be the favorite, even though Faramir is more like Denethor. So I think that, you know, there's no influence to cast out. Denethor is also a little depressed. He's lost his son. He's grieving. He's despairing. Gandalf can't really just cast a spell to cheer you up. It doesn't really work like that. What he did for Theoden in the book wasn't a spell, but he got Grima out of there. He recognized the problem and eliminated the problem. And then he talked to Theoden and he used his words. Things like, take up your sword again. You'll feel strong again. And he got him going. He got the king really fired up, you know. With Denethor, it was a bit different because Denethor was strong and he was mighty and he was just in mourning. So his madness in the book was not as great as... Or it was less pronounced, I would say, and it happened more towards the end. And it was due to the fact that now he thought that Faramir was dead or dying with no hope of being saved. So, there was also the fact that, you know, Gandalf chose to save Faramir over Theoden. We'll get into that. I have a question about that too. It seems a lot of the questions that I got this week are sort of like hitting on the same themes and the same notes, which is why I had a hard time paring them down, because so many of them play off of each other. But good question. Okay, so this next question was submitted by Gus Williams, who asks, and this is, I was just talking about this, did Gandalf make the wrong choice in saving Faramir from his father's pyre? Imagine the number of lives that would have been saved had Gandalf the White had been unleashed on the forces of Mordor during the Battle of Pelennor Fields. So, Gandalf did actually think about this. He wondered this himself, which is why when Pippin was trying to pull him away from Pelennor to save Faramir, and keep in mind that like Pippin seemed to have like kind of a strong connection to Faramir. I believe even one of his sons might have been named Faramir. It was either Pippin or Sam that named one of their sons Faramir. I believe it was Pippin. But anyway, Gandalf was actually wondering this, like there are many more lives that I could save on the field. And then of course when Theoden had passed, when he realized that, he felt really bad about it. Now, there's a big difference between the death of Theoden, which Gandalf could have prevented, but did not, and the possible death of Faramir that Gandalf did prevent. There's actually a few big differences. Gandalf didn't seem to realize that he was kind of upset. I think he must have realized it later when he wasn't angry with himself or upset or just wondering what he could do. the real truth of the matter is Gandalf can't save everyone. And at least Theoden had a fighting chance, and all the people on the fields of the Pelennor were fighting. They had a fighting chance, and many of them died, but they all died protecting Gondor. You know, Theoden, King of the Mark, he died valiantly in battle. Now, with Faramir, we were looking at something more akin to a murder, because his father had gone quite mad and was going to burn him because he thought that either Faramir was dead. I think he realized that Faramir was alive, but I think he also felt that there was no hope for his recovery, and he might as well just go now, right? Faramir was unconscious, he was very sick, he had no defense against this. He didn't have a fighting chance. Now, another important thing is that Theoden was not killed instantly. He lingered for a little while, he got to say goodbye to Eowyn, and he also got to endorse his nephew Éomer as King of the Mark. So that line did not end. There is still a King of Rohan. However, if both Denethor and Faramir had passed, the line of Hurin, the Stewards of Gondor, that would have ended. Now, you might say that Aragorn would have appointed a steward, and we're going to talk about the stewardship in a little more in another answer that I'm going to give you guys, another question that was submitted. But it had been a tradition for it to be the line of Hurin for ages, and it would be a shame if Hurin's line ended there. So, another good question. Okay, so this question, this next one was submitted by Jack Frost. So Jack Frost asked me, how did J.R.R. Tolkien's experience during World War I influence his writing? Now, firstly, I should say that while it would be impossible for such an important, harrowing, and traumatic event, such as the Great War, to not influence his writing, his works were not about the war, nor any other real-life conflict. Tolkien bristled greatly at the suggestion that his work was an allegory for this work or for that work, for this war or that war. But that's not to say that his life experience didn't show up in his work, because it absolutely did. The most important bit to understand is the concept of there and back again, which is the subtitle to The Hobbit. It's very important. Going out on an adventure that turns out to be very dangerous, frightening, life-changing, and then returning as a changed person, but still hoping to find that your home remains as you left it. You're able to go home again. We see a little bit of this in The Hobbit. Bilbo goes out on his adventures, and he's ready to return to his comforts, his leisure, but he's been declared dead, his stuff is being auctioned off, and he finally gets that all cleared up, and he finds that he lost his reputation. He's thought of as sort of a kook. The hobbits of the Shire really don't respect him anymore. And he winds up being okay with that, but it's still showing that things have changed in a very fundamental way for Bilbo. Now, in The Lord of the Rings is a much more pronounced version of this. The hobbits return with much more profound traumas, particularly Frodo. Frodo was really messed up. Their home's a wreck, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in another answer. Like I said, everything seems to be interconnected this week, and it's not by design. I just got a lot of questions that really hit on the same notes here. So Saruman, who was sort of like the guy behind everything when it came to the Shire being taken over, he said, "It'll be difficult to undo in your lifetime what I have done. You could fix some of it, but you can't fix all of it. Things have changed in a very real way, in a very permanent way." And he said that that would also make him very happy thinking about that. And that's sort of like one of the central themes. It's not the central theme, because there is no singular central theme in The Lord of the Rings. There's many central themes, but this is one of the biggest ones, is that you really can't go home again, right? Tolkien himself had gone off to war. He returned home. Everything had changed. There was more technology. There was more machine. There was less green. And going to war is sort of a loss of childhood. I mean, let's be real. We don't send men out to war. We send boys out to war, and some of them come home as men. And some of them might be still hoping to be boys because they still are young, but they've seen things and they've done things that you can't even imagine. And they just hope that their home is still there for them and it's still the same, and it rarely is the same. It's almost never the same. And that's like why Frodo had to leave Middle-earth. He had to sail west because it was never going to be the same for him. He had to be healed, not just of his physical ailments, but his mental and spiritual ailments as well. So, yeah. Very good question. And this next one's sort of on the same beat. This was requested by Alice Stone. Alice gives me very good questions. And Alice asks, very simply, how does the Scouring of the Shire resonate with you? And I actually love this because the Scouring of the Shire is, I think, the most important bit in all of The Lord of the Rings. I understood why it didn't make it into the films, because The Return of the King was already a very long film with, as everybody said, a lot of endings. And then adding even more, this big storyline, it would have been too much. I always feel like, honestly, The Return of the King should have been 2 films, not just 1. I mean, I think all 3 books could have been 2 films because they were they're 3 volumes, but 6 books, so to speak. So the Scouring of the Shire, incredibly important, probably the most important part of the entire story of Lord of the Rings. And I'm just going to reiterate a little bit of what I said previously. When Bilbo returned from his adventure, he had to deal with the fact that he'd been declared dead. He was gone for 14 months. Nobody knew where he was. There were all these hobbits in his house, auctioning off his things, hoping to get a good deal on all this stuff. And Bilbo was rich before he left. He was probably the richest guy in all of Hobbiton, and probably in maybe like the top 10 richest hobbits in all of the Shire. The Baggins family was very wealthy. The Took family and the Brandybuck family more so, but the Baggins family had done very well for themselves. So he sets everything right. He gets all his stuff back, but of course, as I mentioned earlier, he lost his reputation. His good standing in the community was pretty much gone. They thought of him as this guy that goes off and does crazy things that hobbits should not do. You really can't go home again. They think of you differently, right? Now, Frodo's return was a sharper lesson, but it was the same lesson. Now, like the author, the hobbits have been away at war. A massive global conflict that marred the world, just like World War I. And they were hoping to see home again, the hills of the Shire, the green, the wonderful Shire that they knew, but it was not meant to be, and it was actually for a few different reasons that it wasn't meant to be. Firstly, obviously, the Shire had been sullied by Saruman and his evil men, the ruffians, and they must be scoured. That means cleaned. It was the cleansing of the Shire. And this didn't happen easily. They didn't just say, no, you have to leave. There was bloodshed. They had the Battle of Bywater. And the hobbits are normally peaceful, but they have defended their realm in the past, but it was from goblins, it was from wargs. In this sense, it was from men. They had to fight men, not goblins who are always evil, wargs who are always evil, but men who can be good and great and noble and kind, but that these men made a choice to be evil and to join Saruman. So it sort of changed things, There was blood on their hands now, where there had not been blood on their hands before. And of course, a lot of them died. A lot of them didn't make it. So, another reason that it had to be this way is it's just a great character study to show the difference between Frodo and then, say, Merry and Pippin. I'm going to leave Sam out of this because he was not super important in the Scouring of the Shire. He was important before it, and he was important after it. But the Scouring of the Shire really highlighted Frodo, Merry, and Pippin. And it's a great character study to show how Frodo changed and how Merry and Pippin changed. Now, Merry and Pippin had ridden off to war, and they had really seen some action. Merry had a hand in killing Sauron's greatest chief. Pippin fought at the Black Gate, and he was nearly crushed to death. They were knighted in foreign lands and had gone from being these rich lads who would become local lords and men of leisure to warlike, toughened guys who were ready to raise up arms at a moment's notice. No greater call was there for the mustering of arms to defend and scour the Shire than there was from Merry and Pippin. Frodo, on the other hand, he had seen horrors that even in Merry and Pippin could not really imagine. And he had been wounded, poisoned, and psychologically and spiritually damaged. Frodo's character changed in a different way. He was done with violence. He was done with war. He wanted peace. Frodo, after they had won the war, the Battle of Bywater, he wanted to just let Saruman and Grima go. Even after, as Saruman was turning to go, and then suddenly he lunged at Frodo with a knife and tried to stab him. Of course, it didn't work because Frodo had his armor on, that wonderful mithril mail that Bilbo had given him. And even then, Frodo said, "I still want him to be able to leave. I'm not hurt. It's okay. Just go. Get out of the Shire. Never come back. I'm done with fighting." And he didn't want there to be an execution, is what it comes down to, because that's what it would have come down to. If Saruman had remained detained and they had to decide on a punishment for him other than exile, it would have been execution. And I think that he thought that the hobbits had already spilled enough blood, and he did not want to see them resort to such things. They never really had crime in the Shire before, and now they were at a point where they were probably going to string the old man up. So of course, events happened where Grima took care of Saruman, and then they shot Grima to death. But my point is that Frodo had changed in a very different way. He was calling for peace, where you might say that it would have been just to have Saruman as executed, right? That would have been justice. But Frodo had seen enough horror, enough bloodshed, and he had seen enough of the peaceful becoming warlike. Now, earlier I said that it's the most important bit of The Lord of the Rings. It's also two different things, and two seemingly contradictory things, the Scouring of the Shire. It's the most real part of the book, but it's also the most fantastical part of the book. And that dichotomy is what I think makes it the most important. It's the most real section because it, mirroring the author's return from the Great War, it plays into the themes in the book. You can't go home again. Your home has changed, or you have changed, or you both have changed, and nothing will ever be the same. War isn't something that happens and then stops and then everything goes back to normal. It changes things. It unleashes horrors that you can't even imagine unless you've actually been through it. And those who have been through it are not going to forget so easily. They can't just go back to their day-to-day lives and forget about it. Now, it's also the most fantastical bit because it checks a little box, wish fulfillment. That's a box in fantasy. That's like one of the many things that makes fantasy fantasy is wish fulfillment. Of course, Tolkien came home from the war as a young man and lamented the loss of the green, the greater technology, the more machines. He would have loved to have fixed it all, right? He'd tear down the machines, replace the trees, restore the England of his youth, but that's not real life. That doesn't happen, right? Technology marches on. War certainly does not stop the march of technology. If anything, it accelerates it, sadly. War does not put a stop to that. Anyway, excellent question. So this next question, this is anonymously submitted, and this person asks, what is the relationship between Elrond and Earendil? So I didn't think about this because at first I thought, well, this, if you don't know, I mean, Earendil is Elrond's father. Elrond is Earendil's son. That's the relationship. But then I thought, well, okay, you're looking for something more than that. What was their relationship? How did they relate to each other? It's a little more complicated. Elrond was born in the First Age in Syrian, and his father was Earendil, his mother was Eowyn, but he didn't really know his parents all that well when he was only 6 years old. And consider that elves become adults at 100, so 6 years old is a baby for an elf, right? They've only been around for a little short amount of time. Now, when he was 6, the sons of Feanor came to Sirion and sacked it. This was the third kinslaying, the worst of the 3 kinslayings, and Earendil was not there. He was a mariner, and he was off at sea. Eowyn was there. She escaped. She took the Noglamir, which was the bracelet of the dwarves, adorned with the Silmaril, and this is what the sons of Feanor were after. And she leapt into the sea and swam away. And Elrond and his brother Elros were pretty much kidnapped by Feanor's sons. Now, after this big battle that happened in Sirion, there were only 2 surviving sons of Feanor. There was Maglor and Maethros. And Maglor and Maethros, basically, they were kind of compelled to want to kill Elrond and Elros because they were technically enemies. However, the Silmaril was no longer there, and they knew it. So their oath is to obtain the Silmaril by any means necessary and to kill anyone who stands in their way or bars them in any way, or anyone who holds the Silmaril. So since it was Elwing who had left with the Silmaril, they were more concerned with going after her than slaying the enemies that were left, especially young boys such as this. So they sort of dumped them in a cave, a waterfall cave, and moved on. But then Maglor had a bit of a crisis of conscience. He felt bad about it. So he returned to the cave, and he wound up actually adopting the 2 boys. And believe it or not, it was actually Maglor who gave them their names. Elrond means cave elf, and Elros is seafoam elf, because they were found in the waterfall cave. Previously, they would have gone by their names in Quenya, which are very similar names, Elrondo and Elrose. So, Maglor raised the boys. He raised Elrond and his brother Elros, and he was basically their father. That was the only father that they really knew. And despite being a murderous, psychopathic psycho, he was actually a good father to Elrond and Elros. After the War of Wrath, Elrond wouldn't see his real parents ever again because his father, Earendil, took to the skies with the Silmaril, and his mother wound up in a lighthouse, and she would, occasionally take the form of a bird and fly alongside Earendil in the sky. So he could look up into the night sky and see his parents, but they're not present, and they never really were all that present in his life. So Elrond didn't really have much of a relationship with his father. He was raised by Maglor. Okay. So next question, Anonymous asks, in The Lord of the Rings, Denethor is the Steward of Gondor. What does that actually mean? So the Steward is a few things, but in the instance of Denethor, he's essentially the de facto ruler of Gondor. The office of the Steward to the King of Gondor was created by King Romandakil I. And the office was basically chief advisor, counselor to the king. And they would appoint stewards who were usually older men, who were very wise, and they would have to take an oath. They would have to be totally and completely dedicated to the country of Gondor. They were not allowed to leave Gondor. They were not allowed to ride out to war. They had to stay there. So that being said, we don't know how many stewards there were, or the names of the first stewards, but the first steward whose name we do know, the most famous of them, was Hurin. And it became tradition after that to pick stewards that were of the line of Hurin. It wasn't like a law, but it just became a thing where, Hurin's son becomes steward, his grandson becomes steward, and so on and so on and so on. So the last king of Gondor was King Eärnur. He vanished, he never returned, and there was no king. So the stewards to the king became the ruling stewards. And they basically ruled in the absence of the king. Denethor was actually the last ruling steward because he died, and his son Faramir became the steward of Gondor, and he immediately recognized Aragorn as the king of Gondor. And he actually thought that he wasn't going to have to be steward anymore, but Aragorn said, the office of the steward shall continue, because Aragorn was not just the king of Gondor, he was also the king of Arnor. So he was going to go off to Arnor in many places traveling, and in those instances, Faramir would of course be the de facto ruler. He would be in charge of Gondor while Aragorn was away. Okay, good question. Okay, so next question. This is another anonymous question, and this person asks, if Isildur, I like this question a lot, if Isildur had cut off all of the fingers from Sauron's 2 hands, would he have become permanently unable to wear the One Ring? So, we know, like in the movie they showed where Isildur just sort of like swiped out with the broken blade with Narsil, and a whole bunch of Sauron's fingers came flying off. In the book, it was just one finger. But what if he cut off all the fingers? Just, you know what? You're never going to wear this ring again. I'm going to cut off this hand. I'm going to cut off your fingers, your hands, your toes. That too, right? Everything, right? You're not going to wear a ring. This is a surprisingly good question. Could Sauron ever wear the ring again? If it came to him, would he be able to use it? So there was a time when losing a body part, or even totally forsaking his body, was basically no big deal to Sauron. But this had changed. The Akalabeth robbed him of his ability to choose a fair form, and may have completely stunted his shape-shifting ability in general. The Sauron of the First Age could regrow a finger. He could regrow an entire body. He was a shapeshifter. But we know that Sauron lost a finger to Isildur, and we know that that finger stayed lost because Gollum described Sauron's black hand as having missing a finger. So we know that he still didn't have the finger that was cut off at the end of the Second Age. So I think it took him a long time to regrow his body, but he didn't regain that finger. And it's because he's separated from a large part of his power. The power in the ring is his own power, but now it's separate from him. It still exists, but he doesn't have access to it. Now, here's the thing, though. We know that he had the One Ring when he was in Numenor. Now, a lot of people say he hid the ring. That's not true. He had the ring with him because he used it in Numenor. It was his power of seduction and domination. And when the Akalabeth happened and Numenor was destroyed, Sauron's body was destroyed, and he was just a spirit. He was naked, essentially. He was a naked Maya. And we know that he went to Mordor in Middle-earth, and he was a spirit that was born on an evil wind. Now, somebody once asked Tolkien, did he have the ring with him? If he had the ring with him, how could he have carried the ring if he was just a spirit? And Tolkien answered in one of his letters, I think it was 221, number 221, somewhere around there. He said, don't worry about it, basically. He said, don't overthink it. Sauron's spirit can hold the ring. All right. And this is actually backed up by the fact that he sent out wraiths to pick up the ring for him. You know, wraiths can ride horses. They can hold weapons. They have cloaks that give them, you know, shape, at least visually. So what I'm basically getting at is Sauron lost a finger. His body lost a finger, but his spirit, his Fear, did not lose a finger. And that reunited with the ring, no matter how many fingers he lost, it's reunited with his own power, and he would regrow those fingers and wear the ring on his fingers. So, interesting question, though. I really like that one. You don't hear questions like that too often. Okay, another anonymous questioner asks, did Sauron ever feel bad for his evil deeds? Yeah, actually, believe it or not, he did. Sauron wasn't said to have participated in the War of Wrath. He was in hiding. After the war ended, he approached Eonwa. He took on a fair form, and he went up to Eonwa, who is another Mire, and he is the herald of Manwë. And Sauron basically told him that he regretted everything he did. He was only following orders. You know, that defense never works, but he tried it. And he wanted mercy. He wanted a pardon. Eonwa told him, I don't have the authority to grant you that. Only Manwë does. You have to go to Valinor and submit yourself to the Valar, and then Manwë will figure out what to do with you. And Sauron didn't go. He chose not to. Maybe he felt it was too humiliating to do that. Maybe he was afraid to do it. I think it was a little bit of both, actually. I think he would have found it humiliating, and he wasn't willing to put himself through that, and I think he was also afraid of what might happen to him. So he stayed in Middle-earth, and he spent the early parts of the Second Age healing Middle-earth, believe it or not. He went around doing good deeds and trying to fix everything, and it seems like he may have been trying to get back in the good graces of the Valar by doing what we would say good works, right? And he didn't feel their grace. He didn't feel their forgiveness. It wasn't coming to him. It wasn't working. So eventually Sauron came to the conclusion that the Valar have lost interest in Middle-earth. They don't care what happens there. It's completely forsaken. and whether or not he immediately slid back into evil, or maybe he figured he needed to take care of Middle-earth, he needed to be in charge, and that actually, you know, goes into his whole love of order, and then that was his path to slipping back into darkness. He just basically became evil again because he didn't do what he was told, right? And this actually goes into the whole thing of the Silmarillion being sort of a Catholic fable. There's one path to heaven, and he was told what that one path was. And instead he said, well, how about I just do some really good works and kind of try to undo all the bad things that I did and the bad things that Morgoth did, and then you'll let me in. But it was ignoring what he was told, that he had to travel to Valinor, that he had to submit himself to the Valar and be judged by Manwë. He wasn't willing to do that. He thought he could find his own path back, and it didn't work out. So, good question. Okay, so this next question, another anonymous one, asks, is the famous quote from The Lord of the Rings, "You shall not pass," non-canonical? I mean, only in the way that in the book it was worded a little bit differently. The speech in Peter Jackson's film is actually almost word for word from the book. There's a slight difference. I'm going to read you the passage here. The Balrog reached the bridge. Gandalf stood in the middle of the span, leaning on the staff in his left hand, but in his other hand Glamdring gleamed cold and white. His enemies halted again, facing him, and the shadow about it reached out like two vast wings. It raised the whip, and the thongs whined and cracked. Fire came from its nostrils. But Gandalf stood firm. "You cannot pass," he said. The orcs stood still, and a dead silence fell. "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. You cannot pass. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Adun. Go back to the shadow. You cannot pass." So there's two differences here between the passage and the scene from the film. The wording of the final line, "You cannot pass," Gandalf repeated this 3 times. He said it at the beginning, the middle, and the end of his speech. Jackson changed the final one, the final instance of "you cannot pass" to "you shall not pass," which, let's be real, is basically the same thing. And it's not worth really getting all that worked up over that was changed. I certainly didn't mind. The other difference is the emphasis, though. In the film, Gandalf escalates slowly, starting off quietly, and then he gets louder and louder until at the end he is built to this climax, this crescendo. "You shall not pass." And it was a great moment. It was an epic moment, and he slams the staff down. So, fantastic, right? In the book, it's a little different. The only exclamation point we see is on the line, "Go back to the shadow." And then there's no exclamation point on the final "you cannot pass," which suggests that that is a little bit more subdued, right? This makes Gandalf a little less hot under the collar. He raises his voice once, and then he regains his composure, and he stays cool. It works very well for the book, just like the scene worked very well for the movie. So it's slightly changed, but that's the way that adaptations are. They have to change some things because what works on page does not necessarily work on film, and vice versa. Okay, next question was asked by Harry Pringle, who asks, if Frodo wanted to return to the Shire after being healed in the Grey Havens, could he? If not, why? Well, if he changed his mind at Grey Havens, that'd be fine. The Grey Havens is a pair of seaports in Lindon, which is in Middle-earth, and that's where he boarded the ship. That's not where his destination was. Now, Frodo was not healed at the Grey Havens, but rather in the Undying Lands, where he sailed to. If he wanted to turn back then, well, too late. It's a done deal. It's a one-way trip, and he knew that. He knew it was a one-way trip. Now, Frodo would not insult the gracious host of Aemon in such a fashion. Under normal circumstances, mortals were forbidden from going there at all. And it was by special grace that Frodo and Bilbo, and eventually Sam and Gimli, were allowed to go. You see, the Undying Lands is not just some place to the west with a lowercase w, at least not anymore. It used to be. It was a continent in the west called Aemon, but it was sundered from Arda in the Second Age in the event called the Akalabeth. Now, the Akalabeth also changed the shape of the world. Arda was a flat disk, and it was changed to a round sphere. If you sail west, you'll never reach Aemon. You'll just loop around to the east. That being said, Frodo actually left the planet. He went someplace that it wasn't west of Middle-earth, it was west of Arda, west of the planet itself. Frodo knew that this was a one-way trip, and this was why he put his affairs in order. He made Sam his heir, he left Sam all of his possessions, including Bag End, because he was leaving the world. And although he still lived for an unknown amount of time after that, once you're no longer in the world, you're counted among the dead, or at least no longer counted among the living. So for all intents and purposes, Frodo was gone from the world, and he could not return in the same way that men cannot return after dying. Okay, next question. This was asked anonymously. Could the Numenorians have defeated the elves of Valinor if Eru, the Valar, and the Maiar had decided to grab some popcorn and sit it out? Just the elves, huh? Maybe they would do okay against the elves. The men of Numenor were mighty, indeed. They were really outnumbered. It was a fleet of ships against an entire continent of elves. And who's to say how outnumbered they really were? There could have been hundreds of thousands of elves on Aemon. Now, I don't think that Pharazôn's heart was really in it anyway. Once he beheld the tranquil beauty and splendor of Tanaquetil, the tallest mountain of Arda, on which its king, Manwë, resided, Pharazôn grew fearful and uneasy. He almost turned the whole thing right around and sailed back to Numenor. It was only his pride that kept him going. But he was cowed merely by the sight of the mountain. I can only imagine how he would feel if Manwë himself, or even his herald, Eowyn, showed himself before him. The only reason that Eru was called upon was the Valar felt that they didn't have the authority to fight the men of Numenor. But I think if Eowyn appeared before them, not to fight, but just to glare at them, fire in his eyes, and only a single gesture pointing eastwards, they would have left. They would have, even the prideful Pharazôn would have turned aside. Now, by this measure, you may think that the Akalabeth maybe was not necessary, but it wasn't so much about stopping Pharazôn in particular, but preventing this from ever happening again. Scooping Aemon off the planet, no one can sail there unless they're meant to sail there, right? And then they took out Numenor, right? Eru made an example out of Numenor. He scooped Aemon off the planet. He would not just sit and relax and watch his firstborn children, the elves, fight his secondborn children. So, also, there's one last thing to consider here. Elves don't really die. They just go home. Fighting them in their home would be like walking up a down escalator. I mean, Pharazôn might feel very mighty slaying elves until he starts to notice the same faces popping up, you know, over and over again. And then Fingolfin shows up and it's a wrap. So, yeah, they wouldn't win. Okay, next question, another anonymous one, asks, why was Denethor so mad at Gandalf for not bringing his son alive to him in Minas Tirith in the Lord of the Rings movie? Was he really that attached to Boromir as his only child? Okay, a lot of things going on here. It wasn't so much that Denethor was angry at Gandalf for not bringing Boromir. He knew Boromir was dead, he was grieving, and he wanted answers. He wanted to know how Boromir died, and more importantly, why Boromir died. Now, the film actually, at first, stuck pretty close to the book here. Gandalf did not want to bring up Boromir's death, but Denethor already knew about it. He had the cloven horn of Gondor, and he demanded answers, and Pippin gave him those answers. Boromir was his favored son, but he was not his only son, as you said. He had a second son, Faramir. Now, this is where it starts to deviate from the book. In the book, Denethor loves Boromir, but he doesn't hate Faramir. It seems in the movie like he really hated Faramir. He does say that he wishes that Faramir had gone on the journey and not Boromir. And I think that Peter Jackson may have misinterpreted this as Denethor saying that if one of his sons were to die, he wished it was Faramir and not Boromir. And this is compounded by the tomato scene, where he basically sent Faramir off to die. In the book, I believe that Denethor loved both of his sons, and Gandalf remarks that Faramir is more like his father than Boromir was. It's quite possible, and I talked about this a little earlier, a theory that I have, that Boromir might not be like his father because Boromir might be like his mother, who had already passed away, and maybe that's why Denethor favors him so much. His son reminds him of his late wife. Now, that's just a theory. That's not canon or anything, but that's just... If I was to ask why does he favor Boromir so much, I would say, well, maybe there's a chance that Boromir is much like the wife that Denethor loved so greatly. And we do know that he loved her greatly. So it is true that he lost his mind in the book, like he did in the movie. And it was because he thought Faramir had died, or at least maybe he knew that Faramir was alive, but felt there was no hope for him anymore, that he was just a goner. He didn't hate Faramir, but he was kind of curt with him. And I think that this is because Faramir was the first to receive the vision. He received it 3 times, and on the 3rd time, Boromir also received the vision. And, you know, as Faramir was very mighty, and he was very much like Denethor, he probably should have been the one to go to Rivendell, and Denethor knew that. But Boromir insisted on going, and Boromir is incredibly stubborn. Once he sets his mind to something, you cannot convince him otherwise, no matter who you are. So I feel that, like, in saying that he would preferred Faramir to have gone, was not saying that he would have preferred Faramir to have died, but that he felt that if Faramir had gone, he would not have died, and that both of his sons would still live. So that's my thought there. Okay, another anonymous questioner asks, why did Pippin take the Palantir in The Lord of the Rings? The answer to this is much the same as why would Bilbo leave his comfortable life and his grand manor to go on an adventure where he would be constantly cold and tired and hungry and miserable. He's a took. I'm half joking here, but for real, Pippin's family are known for their daring, fiery spirits and almost insatiable curiosity, and he's certainly no exception. Pippin was the one who picked up the ball, and Gandalf thanked him and took it from him very carefully, not touching it, because he didn't know what it was. Gandalf's very wise. He's not about to touch some magical implement thrown down by Wormtongue, and he doesn't know what it is. It could be something very dangerous. So Gandalf saw this as getting something possibly dangerous away from Pippin, who could have been very harmed by this. Pippin thought of it differently. He's being thought of as a boy, which he really is. He's being dismissed and cast aside, and his questions he always had questions. Pippin was always asking questions, and they weren't being answered. So he couldn't rest. He couldn't get to sleep. He had to take a look. Merry tried to talk him out of it, and it was just, you know, Pippin was just in his nature to look. He always had to look. And it actually worked out, because Pippin didn't actually tell Sauron anything important. And Sauron assumed that Pippin was a captive in Orthanc, and that Saruman had therefore recovered the One Ring. And he sent a Nazgul to pick it up. Now, knowing what the ball was also led to Aragorn messing with Sauron's mind, and letting Sauron assume that Aragorn now had the ring, because there were no hobbits or rings at Orthanc, and all of a sudden this tall man shows up waving Elendil's sword reforged. Clearly that guy must have the ring, right? Alright, next question, also anonymous, asks, how do the orcs in The Lord of the Rings reproduce? They are depicted in the movies as simply being dug out of the ground. If that's how they're obtained, why hasn't Rohan or Gondor raised such an army as auxiliary troops? Peter Jackson was taking some creative liberties, not necessarily with how orcs or goblins are birthed, but the creation of Uruk-hai. They're goblin-human hybrids. He wanted to show Saruman being told to raise an army and then very quickly doing so. So a fully formed goblin man can burst out of what looked like a muddy egg, like a spawning vat in the ground. Realistically, orcs reproduce themselves the same way that any other race does, sexually. Elves do it, hobbits do it, dwarves do it, even birds and bees do it. So in creating the Uruk-hai, Sauron would be breeding Uruks with men. Gross, yes, I know. Even if you could just mine for orcs that way, just dig and get some orcs, orcs are evil. You don't want them in your army if you're Rohan or Gondor. Okay. Next question, also anonymous, asks, did Legolas and Gimli like each other more in the Lord of the Rings books or the movies? I would say they like each other equally in both the books and the movies, though there is a final detail of the conclusion of their friendship that was not put into the films, understandably so. So let me just talk about that. Legolas and Gimli became close friends while spending time together in Lothlorien, and they were pretty much inseparable from then on. After the war, they did travel together. They went to Mirkwood Forest, they went to Erebor to meet their respective lords, and then they went to places like the Glittering Caves and Fangorn Forest. Gimli lived to be 262 years old, and close to death, he confessed his last wish, to see the Lady Galadriel one last time. So Legolas was like, let's go. He built a ship, and they sailed from the mouth of the Anduin River along the straight path to the Undying Lands. Gimli had become the fourth mortal and first and only dwarf ever to sail west. This was done without any leave from Círdan. They didn't use the Grey Havens. They weren't in Lindon. It was a ship that Legolas had constructed on his own. So it's somewhat unusual for a Cinda like Legolas to sail west, because they were descendants of the Umanyar. They were elves that were not of Aemon. They had no strong connection to it. But remember that he felt the call of the gulls, the sea longing. And there you have this dwarf going. Dwarves, that's unheard of in history for a dwarf to go to Aemon. So their friendship was just that good. It's not to say that their friendship wasn't strong in the films. It's just that films can only show so much. And this wasn't even in The Lord of the Rings. It was in the appendixes, really. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of tidbit from the books just to show that they were really, really the best of friends. And the final question that I have here today was submitted anonymously. It's about Eowyn. What examples of bravery does Eowyn show in The Lord of the Rings? So Eowyn is one of the most tragic characters, I think. She's the spirit of a warrior, but the body of a maid. She's forced to tend to her beloved uncle, whom she loved as a father, and watch him basically slowly slip into what Tolkien called dotage. We might say dementia, right? Or senility. And he was under the dark spell of Saruman and Grima Wormtongue, and the country that she loved was going to ruin with him. So, because she was a woman, she was not seen as a warrior of Rohan until she took matters into her own hand. She guised herself as a man, called herself Helm, and she rode to war secretly along with Theoden. She also took Merry, because I think she sympathized with Merry. Merry didn't want to be left behind. He felt, even if it was dangerous and really not a smart idea for him to go, all the songs that we sung about the Battle of Palantir Fields, he wouldn't be mentioned except that he was not there, right? So let's talk about the Witch King, right? There's no greater power that the Witch King has, or that any of the Nazgul has, other than fear, right? That's their chief power. That's their biggest, most important power, is fear. His very presence was enough to take the average warrior and reduce him to insanity, to a gibbering mess who would wail and cast himself onto his face on the ground in terror. Now, an above-average warrior, the most hardened warriors could manage to maybe not quail against the Witch King, but their steeds would go insane. Only Shadowfax among horses could really stand up against the Witch King. So, in the presence of one whose very aura causes wailing and gnashing of teeth, Eowyn stood between the Nazgul and Theoden, who lie dying after being dismounted and crushed by his horse at that. She thought he'd already died. She didn't realize he was still alive. He would pass shortly, but he was still lingering. And her only thought was to save his body from being mutilated, from being marred by the Witch King. and her courage was enough to inspire Merry to strike, which set in motion the killing blow. So she was so brave that her brother Éomer, who thought she was dead, became enraged when he did not see his sister interred in honor next to Theoden. And he demanded to know why his sister's body did not lie in state in honor equal to the king. And of course, Prince Imrahil told him she's still alive, which Éomer was very happy to hear that, of course, and she wound up being healed by Aragorn, and she wound up marrying Faramir and had a great life, but that's how much of her bravery there was. So that's all the questions that I have for this week. Like I said, it's a little bit of an extra long video because I couldn't pare it down as much as I would have liked to. There were so many great questions and so many interlocking themes. So many people were asking things that were adjacent to other things, so I had to cover 17 of them. But anyway, guys, leave me your questions, leave me some comments. If you want to put questions in the comments, I will answer them. But if you want them featured in a video, just follow the link in the description to my Quora. You can make an account there very easily. If you have a Facebook account or a Google account, you can just sign in with that and submit any question that you have about Tolkien's works. And tag me in it, and I will answer it. And if I really like the question, it'll be in the next video. See you next week.